I want to welcome everybody to today's Sustainable Project Delivery webinar series. So here in this webinar today, this is our third one of our spring series here with it focusing on that integrated design. And I am Nicole Burman, and I will be your MC today. So I'll be helping Andy today during the presentation. So please make sure if you have any comments, put them in the chat, and I will be there to address them with the presenter. So today we have our presenter is Andy Temeyer, and he is a registered architect and program project manager for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Omaha District. So he has been with the Omaha District for 12 years or more, and Andy has extensive experience in sustainable design and development of all phases of project delivery, and has been on the teaching cadre for the Prospect 244 Prospect course for sustainability since 2015. And he is a graduate of the Iowa State University with a professional degree in architecture and has a LEED AP B+C certification. So he was born and raised and currently resides in the Council Bluffs, Iowa area, and is currently serving as the Army Corps of Engineers Program Manager for the B-21 bed down at Ellsworth Air Force Base. So I will go ahead and hand it over to you, Andy.
Thanks, Nicole. Welcome, everybody. So today, I want to kick things off. Ultimately, typically teach this class this module as one of the lead-in modules to the Prospect course. Integrated design, as we'll talk about, is extremely critical in our view in delivering high-performance, sustainable buildings. And I guess, in preparing for today, I was kind of curious, for those on the line, if you could open up your chat box, and on a scale from 1 to 10, from where you sit and from your perspective, how well do you think your district is at incorporating sustainable design or integrated design into your design and project delivery process? 1 being kind of we're wandering around in the dark, and 10 being this is easy. What are we here talking about? So this is interesting. 0. All right, we even expanded the spectrum. 3. All right, so everybody kind of feels like, I don't know, if you average these out, kind of in the middle of the spectrum. So I think that's good. I think that's good feedback and good for us to understand, as we teach this Prospect course in the future and we talk today. We definitely want to create some dialogue here. So and understand how we can continue to better communicate strategies and techniques and things like that to make integrated design better understood throughout the Corps of Engineers. So ultimately, see if we can go to our next slide here. Our objective today is to describe the integrated design process. And for some of you, maybe this is all old news. Some of you it may be extremely new. And we'll try to walk through that. As far as resources go, hopefully we begin to give you a few threads to pull here. This certainly isn't going to be a comprehensive course on how to successfully execute integrated design on all of your projects, but obviously UFC 1200-02 is a good resource and a lead-in to how integrated design should be applied to our military projects. I believe it references the International Green Construction Code, Appendix F, and that appendix is purpose-built around integrated design process and concepts and how you should apply integrated design in order to facilitate high-performance sustainable buildings throughout the planning process, whether that's in planning and programming, design charrettes, and all the way through contract execution. LEED version 4 and 4.1 are predominantly the LEED versions that our projects are probably focused on nowadays. There's the integrative process credit. hopefully that dovetails fairly well with what we're talking about here, but there's obviously some documentation requirements that you need to run interference with in your design process and think about if you happen to be executing a project that requires LEED certification. Whole Building Design Guide has a few resources and links that if you follow that hyperlink there, it takes you to a web page that talks about integrated design process. And I believe the following two references, they're a little bit architect related. I'm an architect, so that's the lens that I see the world through. But ultimately, I think architecture community of practice has kind of been talking about integrated design for quite a while, and it translated well into into sustainability. So we will discuss the theory of integrated design, kind of where the maybe the theoretical underpinnings of this began, integrated design, what the process looks like, some of the requirements, and how we actually go about achieving this in actual practice. As we are well aware, sometimes the theory and the practice require different approaches and lines of thought. So integrated design theory, as kind of described by the Whole Building Design Guide, is where you're ultimately identifying goals early on using or leveraging a comprehensive team of stakeholders, and then endeavoring to hold those goals and requirements in proper balance, so that you're not allowing individual interests, requirements, and relationships to supersede the requirements, dependencies, and relationships of that are also identified. So as you look through, typical design objectives on projects, here's a few. These certainly aren't all of them, but accessibility, aesthetics, cost effectiveness or budget, functional operational concerns, concerns associated with historic preservation, productivity, resilience, sustainability. All of these things are important, and ultimately, most projects are faced with several, if not all, of these constraints and more. And using maybe more traditional design theories, there's a tendency for whoever is front-loaded in the process to kind of drive those priorities. Integrated design theory says that we need to identify these things early on, document them, socialize them with a comprehensive team, and then track implementation of those things throughout the entire design process, so that those priorities don't fall out of balance. Many of you may have seen a cost impact curve somewhat similar to this. So if you look at lines 1 and 2, that's a traditional cost and impact curve. What that's trying to communicate is the amount of impact that you can have on a project for a corresponding cost is much higher early on in a design process than if you start making those decisions or try to make those changes or change requirements later in the design process. So if you look at line 3, that represents what we maybe label as a traditional design process, where you're fairly generic and maybe light on requirements. And then as you get later into design, development, and construction documentation, that's where a lot of your requirements and your effort are occurring, are being defined. And what that does, it creates an imbalance in the design process, and it creates a lot of risk to a project where if you're not defining those things early on, the potential for budgetary impacts or cost impacts increases. So the theory of integrated design is that it is very much a front-loaded effort. You get all of your stakeholders in the room, or in nowadays maybe a virtual environment, get them to socialize and discuss and prioritize requirements on a project, and establish parameters and boundaries to hold those in check, so that as you progress through schematic design, design development, and then ultimately construction documentation, you have all of those requirements in front of you. You're not in a discovery phase and trying to balance new requirements as you try to crank out some drawings and some specifications. So ultimately, reality hits sometimes, and these things aren't always, these concepts don't always get executed in a perfect manner. But this represents kind of the ideal picture of how an integrated design process would work with respect to the overall project execution.
Hey, Andy.
Yep.
I would also argue, not being afraid of maybe spending a little bit more time in that upward approach to that arch there on line 4. Not being afraid to spend a little bit more time in that integrative design section of the concepts and so forth, so that you can maximize that decision-making process and information gathering.
Right. I fully agree. And I was looking at this slide yesterday, and one of the things that, if I were going to change this slide today, I don't think that we should be shy about the idea that potentially, one of the main critiques of integrated design that we always hear, whether it's in prospect courses or in the last webinar, is, well, doesn't this take a lot more effort and take, maybe cost a little bit more to use this process if you're front loading everything? Doesn't it represent a huge amount of effort? And the answer is, well, kind of, and maybe that's okay. I don't think that this necessarily needs to cost a profound amount more. It may change where you spend your money in a design timeline, but the general theory of integrated design is that you're using time and resources during design and early in design so that you can have a positive impact on the project's cost and performance. So I'm not sitting here advocating for an additional 25% design fee on every project, but ultimately the whole idea of why we go about designing facilities is so that we are properly planning them before we start digging holes in the ground and things like that. So ultimately, that doesn't mean that we don't have to account for those design costs and where we're spending that money. But if we were going to make this curve 4 so that there's more area under the curve, maybe to represent a little bit more cost, I think that that's a conversation that we need to have, so that that ultimately we're cognizant of the entire intent here is to provide value to the longer project timeline. I was trying to read it. We had a comment here. Charrette reports are great, but should almost be validated when the design phase starts. Yeah, it probably depends on ultimately what charrette reports we're talking about. Are we talking design charrette reports?
Yeah, so I would say to this would be, a planning charrette is then validated by that design charrette, and then a design charrette, in my mind, really seeking at that schematic design phase. So that SB on this chart would be that validation period, which we should be seeing and reading in your design analysis or BODs, really understanding how that has changed maybe from what you saw or developed during the charrette.
Right. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next slide here. Ultimately, though, I think this slide is really important. I think it clearly communicates what maybe our end goal is. Front load this process a little bit so that we can have a higher impact for lower costs on the overall project delivery lifecycle. So, if you start digging through some of the documentation that the American Institute of Architects has, they kind of talk about multiple, maybe theories or practices for how design has happened over the decades and the centuries and things like that. When you talk about traditional practices, architects worked closely with the trades. Think of, I don't know, building cathedrals in Europe or things like that. Ultimately, there's reasons for that, but ultimately, there was a much closer link between the work between how architects develop design concepts. Documentation certainly wasn't what it was today, and our ability to document and their ability to document wasn't necessarily what it is today. And then ultimately, you know, they work closely with tradespeople to construct facilities. A lot of times, those things were worked out as the project was being built. You know, as building systems, things like artificial lighting, HVAC systems, communications infrastructure, sanitary systems, all that stuff became more prevalent in facilities. You know, in the 20th century, there was a much greater need to develop, to plan and to create designs to communicate facility requirements before you ultimately start constructing them. That was somewhat limited by technology. It was also limited, not limited, but it kind of came out of this, you know, evolved from this traditional practice where architects maybe led the way and then developed a concept or a building envelope, and then engineers and building systems professionals were required to come in, and, you know, ultimately there was coordination that occurred, but it was kind of a top-down sort of process. An architect develops a floor plan, they check it over the cubicle or into the next office, over the next building. Engineers fill it with lights and HVAC systems, and then ultimately those items are solicited and awarded to a builder that then interprets that design package and constructs it. You know, I think a lot of us have had some exposure to that, but, you know, in talking, in kind of seeing the poll results, a lot of us, you know, there may be a fair number of people on the line that integrated design practices are kind of their norm. So this is where you have a multidisciplinary team of designers, consultants, building users, you know, maintainers, things like that are involved from the project from the very beginning. That doesn't necessarily mean their level of involvement is all equal, or that all stakeholders' a voice is weighted equivalently, but ultimately it means that everybody has a spot at the table nonetheless. They're engaged to a degree for the full project lifecycle. Everyone has eyes on the project and is tracking it, and then there's a continual degree of evaluation of impacts of design decisions to the entire set of project requirements, rather than what's best for the architect, what's best for the electrical engineer, things like that. And it's a much more team-based and collaborative approach to delivering designs, and very much creates more opportunity to, for lack of a better word, integrate building systems for higher performance. More documentation. So Ed Gabbro says more documentation does not necessarily mean better documentation. Fully agree. We'll talk more in other webinar modules, but, you know, we talk about construction documents and, you know, do we ultimately have to draw all the details that we draw? Is there value with those things? As we try to deliver designs efficiently, maybe there's some decisions that need to be made. Instead of continually drawing everything that we drew the last time, continuously evaluate what the value of some of the documentation that we provide is communicating those higher level goals that the project establishes. So during planning and programming, form a collaborative, comprehensive team. Make sure that all, you know, you may not have a full grasp of all stakeholders at this stage, but you have representation from a team of personnel that can at least voice perspective from a diverse project group. Analyze, you know, your broader site landscape, climate, whether it's macroclimate, microclimate, weather patterns, wind. You know, this is the time to do sun studies to frame how your project or how your facility may sit on its site. Extremely important to start talking about energy, water, and material goals. You know, not all projects, not all installations, not all sites can leverage the exact same goals. Sometimes it's easy to say, well, these are the goals that are typical on base, so we should just kind of maybe blindly apply those goals to a project. But ultimately, that I think we all kind of realize that that's not necessarily true. Individual sites may be more, maybe they're not in the main cantonment area on a base. Maybe they're, maybe they have a unique set of site constraints for your specific project that's going to drive, for better or for worse, energy or water savings goals, things like that. And then ultimately set some priorities. Try to establish what goals are most achievable. Try to establish what ones are going to require a little bit more work or a little bit more investigation. Document those things so that they're not forgotten as soon as you hit the next stage in your project's life cycle. Ultimately, we'll talk about the OSD DCA process in the LORD memo during later modules, but ultimately, this is the absolute inception of where you're going to be starting to establish budget and programming parameters for your project. So if there are goals that potentially drive budget and programming requirements, this is the time to get them on the table. The most successful projects are going to be the ones that have the budget and scoping that align with the goals that are identified. During schematic design, go ahead.
Sorry, Andy, on that, in thinking of, especially for planning charrettes making those 1391s, we've seen a lot of effort needing to be focused on that sustainability piece, because if there are ultimate goals, like you said, we want to make sure if that requires an additional, cost that maybe in the long run with life cycle cost, it would be effective, but it wouldn't be if we don't put that, cost in that 1391, looking at that same curvature. If we don't have that originally identified, then we still can't attain that goal.
So, one of the mind-numbing conversations that feels like we're on Groundhog's Day, around here every once in a while is geothermal systems. Geothermal systems cost more, right, typically, but they have a long-term payback in certain instances. So if you're starting to establish project budgets and you budget for a geothermal system and you accompany that with lifecycle analysis at the planning and programming phase, the likelihood that that's going to get supported in the 1391 and programming and budgeting process is much higher than if you, stumble upon that idea at the design charrette phase when maybe your budget is locked, you haven't done any life cycle cost analysis, and then you find out, oh, maybe this is a value to the project, but then you're at a budget deficit, and you're trying to find budget clearance to include a system that ultimately has a life cycle payback. So I know, speaking from project experience in the past, that has been a topic, and it's like ultimately nobody should. I think everybody agrees, but ultimately, don't undersell those opportunities early in the process and then create this kind of self-perpetuating cycle where you're always fighting from behind. So ultimately, during schematic design, you're going to start to try to look at primarily start with passive design strategies, look at site orientation, look at, again, cycle back on life cycle cost analysis, use an initial energy model to inform your decisions. This whole idea that you're going to create one energy model on a project and then, stamp it, you're done. Like that's not reflective of necessarily of an integrated design approach. Ultimately, that also doesn't mean that you're creating a train trace model on day one. Use the right tool for the job. There's an abundance of different modeling tools out there, and you may not have enough clarity and degradation in your design to be able to develop a train trace model. But use the tools that use building massings, use building zones, and define those in an energy model to better build on what you established in planning and bring a little bit more clarity and establish and refine the application of those goals to your specific project. Look at daylighting. That's going to vary. That the effects of those may and implementation of those things may vary widely depending on your climate zone. in your site-specific constraints. You've got a bunch of tall buildings or something, directly around your project. Start to understand that. That has the potential to impact internal lighting systems, shading strategies, what you may want to do with the landscape, things like that. And then during schematic design, you can absolutely start to get a grasp on, water use, potentially how much water you can save on a project. We teach in the prospect course that a lot of times you can start your LEED calculations for water use at schematic design, or maybe even earlier, depending on how deep you dove into your planning charrette effort. And it sometimes seems crazy because a lot of us find ourselves doing those calculations later in design, but a lot of times that stuff doesn't change that much once you've established your basic building occupancy, your manpower, your fixture counts probably aren't going to change that terribly much. During design development, you're refining and trying to reconcile those basic concepts that you studied and analyzed for strategies for sustainability on the project, and trying to reconcile those with actual features, actual systems, actual technology that may be applied that you can define in detail in construction documentation stage. You're continually reevaluating design decisions and coordinating with other disciplines to make sure that the design decisions you're making within your discipline do not undermine or do not create negative synergies is probably a bad way to say that, but negative impacts to other design decisions that are being made by other integrated team members and deliverables or systems. I kind of feel like, kind of in my career, I kind of started with with practices that were maybe a little bit less integrated, and it felt like we were always in construction documentation phase. Integrated design kind of should generate a focus on iterative evaluation of systems, so that by the time that you get to construction documentation, you're really more in a drafting effort. Ultimately, coordinating the coordination of all your building systems should have occurred long before you hit construction documentation phase. And I think that this is a tendency that I think the Corps of Engineers, may have developed over time, but we tend to be a drawing and drafting heavy in our design process. And ultimately, that's not always the correct strategy for vetting applicability and integration of all these systems. So make sure that we're all using the correct tool for the job and being cognizant and thoughtful about how we go about delivering coordinated designs, and figure out the right way to communicate this stuff with stakeholders as well. Ultimately, it's not always a construction document that's the best way to communicate how we're delivering an integrated project. And then also develop engineering considerations, instructions, field personnel. This is all about communication. There's a lot of thought and a lot of background on the design decisions that are made through the design and planning process. So figure out how to communicate that. So when construction personnel, when our project engineers pick up these projects, not only do they have the set of contract requirements, but they have the background and maybe context and emphasis on the things that you as a design professional or as a planning professional think need a little bit more focus, a little bit more attention to detail, and or just are maybe unique and are going to require a little bit more
So Andy,
clarity as you progress.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
I'll kind of piggyback on that. We mentioned this in the last webinar with construction. When we're talking about and thinking about our field personnel with integrative design, that's them included at the very beginning of design and throughout all of these reviews and iterations. So when I think of the ECIFP, I really think of that as maybe that quick stop that they can remember what that discussion was, and especially when we're looking at meeting the UFC, sustainability UFC, and meeting third-party certification, trying to get those principles met along with policies. We want to make sure that this document identifies if there's some critical pinch points, right? We, as designers, we think of those during design, and when we make a decision, and we may think, okay, if I detail this appropriately and work it this way, we'll be able to meet it. But in that same moment, maybe that moment that we should write that in these instructions here to the field, so they're also equally brought that clarity and that highlight of this would make or break meeting those sustainability principles. Over.
Yep, agree. So Sheila has a question. Do RFPs for design build projects require obtaining this credit specifically or meeting the HPSB guidelines? I'm not sure what credit we're referring to. Maybe she can clarify this.
For when we put in the credits or specific scorecards, it will indicate in the project in both RFP, or it should, in both RFP and in the design bid build situation, the credits that the project is obtaining. Then the 013329 spec specifically identifies that which ones, if a contractor or designer, if it's design build, identifying a credit is not obtainable, they have to receive official correspondence and concurrence from the Corps that they can, switch that out. So I would say the answer to Sheila's question is yes. All of our contracts should specifically identify what those are required. There may be instances that maybe we still have a maybe in an RFP situation to identify an opportunity that they can determine how far they want to go with that sustainability credit or feature.
Okay, so she did clarify the integrated process LEED credit. So I have not been serving a lot of Army and LEED-centric projects recently, and maybe Nicole, you can help clarify this. But so the UFC definitely requires utilizing an integrated design process. Ultimately, as far as whether we're required to retrieve the LEED credit, do you have a straight answer for that? I thought is it a mandatory credit?
It's not a mandatory credit for certification, so it's not a prerequisite. Okay. It is an optional credit. In my mind, if I'm reviewing one, because we require that in our process, I would question anybody who's not trying to pursue
that thinks that they can't get it. Yeah. I would agree. It's like ultimately, I don't think that we see a huge amount of inconsistency between what the LEED credit requires you to document and the process that the UFC dictates that we follow.
Yeah, and typically it's a misunderstanding potentially of the credit that right. holds somebody to say no, or maybe at that time when I would consider it to be a yes always.
Right, agreed. Sheila, hopefully that answers your question. Okay, so I'm going to move on here.
We also had a comment, I guess, above from Allison talking about during programming stage, if things fall short of that life cycle cost effectiveness, having some pushback and adding that to the 1391 or the that big picture element there. So, for me, right, we are focused on that life cycle cost analysis and determining that effectiveness. But there is a factor there that we have to hold to. But there is a factor, like we mentioned, of making that determination earlier would demonstrate maybe more effectiveness, right? More opportunity by putting that in a project day one versus others. And then I think that this will evolve over time too, and what you include in that analysis. But I don't know what your experience has been, Andy.
Well, I would say, ultimately all projects are kind of bound by their scope and budget constraints, right? So this these sorts of constraints do present themselves. And I guess the biggest suggestion is document and analyze your way into a position where ultimately it's not the engineering team. Maybe it's not even USACE that is in the position to arbitrate that. Provide your stakeholders with enough information that says, well, here we got a problem here. You know, maybe we're late in the programming cycle. I don't know, or maybe we found out something was life cycle cost effective, but we're going to have to reconcile that life cycle cost effective strategy with our budget and allow the appropriate stakeholders to make that decision rather than to let the design process solve that problem for you. And I'm trying to say that with a negative connotation, I guess. You know, so provide enough information to the stakeholders that actually have the authority to make those decisions, and then allow those decision points to be resolved appropriately. If something is not life cycle cost effective, I would suggest that I would say the DoD has been pretty clear about we want to be implementing things that provide long-term value to the Department of Defense. So I don't like if there's a way to document that something is not life cycle cost effective, get that to your stakeholders and allow the appropriate ones to make the correct decision on whether or not to implement something. Maybe there's a parameter that's missing in your life cycle cost analysis that needs to be considered. I don't know. And maybe that changes the conclusion. But ultimately, document that stuff as early as you possibly can, and get them get those decisions or those touch points in the hands of the correct stakeholders, so that you can establish a path forward. During construction, so make sure sustainability is a part of the discussion from the moment that you kick off construction. Include discussion of sustainable design goals, strategies. How about, discuss the contract requirements. Your project should have sustainability requirements in almost all cases attached to the project. So make sure that those are identified. Make sure not only that the contractor understands them, make sure that everybody in the construction and the resident office understands them. It's not a foregone conclusion that everybody in the design or in the construction office fully understands what maybe your waste requirements are on the project, or what their role is in enforcing these things as you start bringing a project out of the ground. Actively use the plans for erosion control, waste management, indoor air quality. Just in general, your sustainability action plan that should be written into almost all of your sustainability reporting requirements in that specification. Make sure that that's being submitted, it's being reviewed. If you don't know how to review it, make sure you get it in the hands of somebody that can review it and understands what that stuff means. And then most of us are retaining requirements to require the contractor employ a LEED AP, especially if your project's LEED certified. Even if it's not a LEED certified project, sometimes there's value in maintaining that requirement, because in general terms, a LEED AP is going to have a pretty good grasp on balancing sustainability requirements across the project. So during occupancy, commission all your building systems prior to occupancy. Oftentimes now that's being done through the total building commissioning specification. There's obviously other ways to do that. The UFC is written relatively broadly to allow your project specific requirements to drive that, but you should be commissioning most of your facilities. Flush out the building prior to occupancy. Make sure the O&M manuals communicate proper operations and maintenance of any systems that may be unique and things like that. And then ultimately make sure that the people that this is a topic that has come up several times during these webinars, but ultimately there's been discussion that a lot of our DPW or CE staff may not understand how some of these systems, these new high performance systems, operate, and so you run the risk of these very integrated, tightly designed facilities falling out of spec. Make sure that they have the training or provided with the training so that at least at the onset, they understand how this facility is intended to operate, and then ultimately are better positioned to spot inconsistencies in performance and things like that.
I would consider commissioning even a really good example if done with a full commissioning team of people of integrative design, because like you said there, Andy, making sure there's training, really that's something that's required in commissioning and even identified in the 0191 spec, but it's something that really should be discussed with a lot of parties of people, including the O&M staff individuals or PSDs themselves. And so there's opportunities there to really have a very well-established integrated team focused on those pieces to make sure that it gets the right product, the right systems manual out to them so that they are prepared and ready to keep that building functioning.
Absolutely. So as you turn over a facility to an owner or a stakeholder, ultimately post-occupancy, we need to evaluate building performance at 1-year intervals, recommission systems periodically to address any problems that are being identified. And then, I think that we were talking about this as a teaching cadre, but we need to stop being afraid to talk about failure. The integrated and iterative design process is absolutely critical that we identify successes and failures and build upon that knowledge base. It's a huge missed opportunity to not share, hey, we made a boo-boo here, but this is how we fixed it, or this is how we can fix it so that it's not a boo-boo ever again. Ultimately, we need to be able to talk about failure, and we need to be able to document it in a manner that whether it's your project team or someone else can pick up on that information and position the next project for even more success. So, again, in reviewing the slide, I think that I personally want to take this as a tasker. I as a designer, I have very little understanding of how our facilities that we turn over are tracked post-occupancy. Are they ultimately recommissioning these projects every 2 to 3 years? I'm not pointing fingers, but I find that kind of hard to believe that it's happening with that degree of regularity. But ultimately, I think that that's something that maybe as a teaching cadre, we need to have a better grasp on. And certainly, we may have other people on the team that have a better grasp on that. But I think that that's something that's worth thinking about.
Andy, I will note that we have lost your slides.
Really? Give me a second here.
Yep.
I'm getting some sort of weird network error.
Okay.
Do you happen to know if you can share the slides, Nicole?
Yeah, let me see. Did you put them in our folder?
They're in the Teams folder.
Okay. I can go grab it.
I'm going to keep trying here. It looks great on my screen.
Fantastic. Okay. I am opening soon.
All right. If you want to go ahead and do that, I can keep talking, or do we want to?
Fine, you can keep going. It'll be open here in just a moment, and then I'll share it.
Okay. So ultimately, the UFC is pretty clear in that this is the most important requirement in achieving a high-performance sustainable building. And I don't think that that's an understatement. It absolutely requires an integrated and collaborative approach to make sure that you deliver a facility that's best positioned to address your project-specific sustainability requirements. Man, it looks like I got kicked off with the whole WebEx here.
I can still hear you, if that helps.
I called in separately, so that should be good. But okay.
That must be why.
If we go, are we on slide 18?
I am on post-occupancy. See, it's slide 16.
All right, let's go to slide 18 if we can.
Oh yeah, here's the reference to UFC, and then 18. Here we are. We're there.
Ultimately, your collaborative team should be composed of users, government support staff, appropriate professionals to help guide the planning and design process, and then ultimately your end goal is to identify requirements and goals early so that those can be tracked throughout the remainder of your project execution process. We talked a little bit about on slide 19, we talked about LEED, BD&C integrated process credit. Ultimately, I don't think the documentation requirements attached to that credit are so profound. It may be one of those things that this becomes so second nature to the way that you operate over time that maybe you haven't written it down. But I think it's probably worth, as a district or as a design branch or design entity, that you spend the time to document those processes, and I think achieving this credit becomes a fairly regular and easy thing to do. Make sure that you're documenting your, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I will say, yeah, what you said there is writing it down, Andy, and one of the biggest lessons learned we have with this is we may already have integration involved with what we do, but for the credit, right, we have to demonstrate that we've accomplished something here and that we're meeting that. So really, if we're meeting the ASHRAE requirement or the International Green Code and identifying those pieces, we should also be writing all of that down in a way that we can upload that naturally to this credit, so it becomes a streamlined process for each team and working that. And that can be done from the beginning, if we're working that early on, and then we already have a credit ready to be reviewed. Over.
Right. So ultimately, we have a couple of case studies here that we can talk about a little bit. I don't really want to dwell on these too terribly much. We were talking as a teaching cadre that some of these are becoming a little bit out of date, and we don't present them as this is what you should attempt to achieve. It's maybe more of an opportunity to discuss what we see as maybe successes. Some of those successes the context for how you're going to have to achieve success on your project may be different, and that's okay. But ultimately, on slide 20 here, this is the EAB company ops facility. At this point in time, this is an old project. I was highly involved in this project, and ultimately, I think it was the first USACE in-house design to get LEED Platinum, but it was under a different LEED version. So the bid climate was very different. The LEED certification requirements were very different. What I really like to talk about this facility is not about how unique it is. It's about how normal it is. We just kind of did some of the things that we always do, and we did them in an integrated manner, and then we seized opportunity where we could find it. So we were blessed to have a good bid climate there. So you can see PV on the roof. We were well positioned to have a bid option for PV, and we awarded it within budget. Those types of things don't happen without some proper planning to make sure that you have a bid option there in the first place. So that's just one example of how you can go about positioning your project for success. Slide 21 is.
So we have a couple items here. So there's a question about if people are using version 4.1 that Allison has identified that they've been using for or version 4 worksheets and have had no problems with that. I do not have anybody currently that I'm around that's using the 4.1 credit for that. Andy, have you heard of anything on your end?
Sorry, playing this mute button. We have a fairly small Army workload right now, so I'm not aware. Maybe that's a question we can follow up on.
Yeah, and then okay, so Kelly Olson, so I wasn't tracking that. Thank you, Kelly. So on our N2W project, actually, it was awarded under the 4.1 credit for this, so that's great. So our AE pursued that and found that one to be one to switch over to 4.1. So if we need to get any examples, we can always provide that to somebody. Brad, you're also asking for examples of that. I think from my experience with the integrative credit form, most of the confusion on that form was because we would be trying to pursue that form and writing that after the fact rather than focusing on the comments real time when we're actually in that initial concept phase. But you are right, there are some wording elements of that if you're maybe not as integrated into what LEED is looking for that could trip some teams up. But what we do as a foundation of our integrative design is present and can be narratively described in a way that meets that credit and have success. I will also put a pitch out there, and I'll just throw it since I have control of the screen. Our ECB that came out this last December has a checklist for success that they went through as one of the attachments. So several of these elements could be those quick thought starters, those questions that maybe we should be asking during the charrette process or early in design and working as a team, looking at how we could pursue these different credits. So that's another way to keep that conversation going and then maybe utilize the answers to these questions into those forms or your own approach to meet that credit. Over. Okay, and which slide do you want us on? You may be still on mute. I don't have my participants up. Here we go. Yep, Andy, you're on mute. I wonder if you can get off mute if you got kicked off the webinar. There you are.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
I can, yep.
All right, so I've been talking away. Can we go to the Seattle District Office?
Absolutely.
So ultimately, what's unique about this project, some of you may have the pleasure of working in this space. It's a pretty unique facility. GSA, I believe, actually awarded the contract for this facility, but it utilized a unique contracting methodology. Not necessarily sure if that's a viable solution for your project or every project, but ultimately they ultimately paid for performance on this facility, and so they established an energy usage intensity on a broad scale, and then incentivized the design build contractor to produce a design and construct a facility that achieved or exceeded those targets. And ultimately, they withheld a certain amount of payment for a year after occupancy. The contractor went as far as to make adjustments halfway through that duration, and ultimately the project exceeded its goals. Contractor received his payment, or the bonus, or the award amount, and then the Seattle District has a facility that's fairly high performing from a sustainability perspective. When we teach the course, there's lots of things that we talk about, unique things and trade-offs that they made in this facility, but ultimately from a sustainability perspective, I think it's a pretty big success. Let's keep going here.
Over there.
Yep. So NREL facility. This is becoming quite an old project, but it's one of the original projects everybody talks about. Is a huge North Star for sustainability. The big thing I'd caveat on this is I think it's a LEED Platinum facility. It's got some pretty unique passive features built into the administrative spaces. It has a unique mechanical system design and obviously a lot of PV on the roof. The only thing I'd caveat with this one is even though it's a very highly performing facility, it's a facility occupied by a bunch of building scientists and renewable engineers and things like that. So that doesn't not necessarily a bad thing. It's probably tailored to the needs and competencies of the users, but it's a pretty special building that ultimately gets a lot of attention to ensure that it's performing at its optimal level. Let's go to the next slide. Nicole, maybe you can talk on this one. I don't have all my notes in front of me. This is project at Fort Leonard Wood, Alpine Power School. I think it's a LEED Gold project. Used the ECI methodology.
Yeah. So this was an in-house team project that utilized that early contract involvement tool, which I think we had a comment about something similar to that element. But what that did is it provided the ability to have that integrative piece where we had the contractor on board early, working with the Kansas City District Design team. They actually, as part of that contract, we had team members in from the contractor in the office 2 days per week, and they were a part of that design in a way that really brought the 3D modeling identification. This is well before we actually had that as a rule. And moving that from both design into construction, bringing that, an element of two worlds, really, of the design bid build piece with a factor and benefit that you would see in design build, working with the contractor early and moving that model through. And so we're really able to find that efforts in design and that field site visits and the coordination meetings for all parties. And so then that also brought up ways to solve problems when they arose in construction. We had that relationship already, the designers with the contractor and the field staff working through integrative pieces that maybe come up when you install multiple systems on a corridor and so forth, working with window placement if that ended up being an issue, whatever may occur, that was really able to be resolved together in a significant way.
Okay. So let's move on to the next slide, slide 26. Ultimately, I think we all need to think about how we can foster a culture of integrated design. So this picture here is maybe one example. It looks like we have BIM models up. Everybody's in the same room trying to talk through and work through, coordination of some building systems. So this isn't necessarily the gold standard. This is just an example. I know in Omaha District, we have what we call BIM pit, a bunch of monitors and a projector where we can go in and do, real-time coordination if we need to. COVID has kind of changed that environment, but it's also exposed us all to a bunch of additional tools that help facilitate collaboration. So whether you're doing this on WebEx or doing it in a room as a team, resist the urge to solve problems on your own. Make sure that you're thinking about how the design decisions you make within your discipline have the potential to affect other disciplines, and then bring those people into the conversation so that you don't, whether unintentionally undermine something that they're tracking as a goal as well. Let's go to the next slide.
We're at 1 minute.
Yep. You're going to try to wrap this thing up here. So project level team integration, make sure those lines of communications are very open. Understand the products that we deliver and what's the best way to communicate what we're delivering to our stakeholders, and then document so that not only your construction personnel understand, but everybody down the pipeline on your project understand the context for those decisions. I think we can probably skip ahead. Ultimately, hopefully this gives you a good idea of what maybe the goals of integrated design are, And I guess I'm available for questions if we want to go a little bit longer here, but I defer to Jansen and Nicole on that.
Yeah, I think if people are willing to stay on, we could probably take a question or two. If there aren't any, of course, we have that MS Teams group for that connection there to be able to answer or follow up. Or if there were questions here, we hopefully will be able to follow up with those answers also.
All right. Looks like most of the people are wrapping things up. I'm sure everybody has things to do. So I really appreciate everybody's participation today. We'll be digging in on some of these topics in other modules. This is kind of a baseline presentation. So certainly keep your eyes open for discussions on individual design phases and things like that. And so thank you everybody for your time, and we'll hopefully talk more later.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Andy.
Thank you.